Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our journey through the native cultures and medicines of the Americas. In this session, we are going to work with Mexico and Central America. And geographically, Mexico is considered to be part of North America, the North American continent, and where Mexico and Guatemala meet, which is just down here, is said to be the dividing line between North and Central America. Central America is this thin bit here that connects North and South American continents. And but for purposes of grouping the cultures together, these are often dealt with together, Mexico and Central America, because the cultures are quite similar between Mexico and Central America and have similar roots, whereas the culture of North America, there's some dividing lines there. So if you consider the Native American cultures from the southwestern United States, then you see, or what's now the southwestern United States, you would see a bit more similarity to the Mexican culture, as well as in what's now Texas has quite a bit of Mexican culture in it. So there aren't any really clean dividing lines, but we'll group these together for purposes of looking at the cultures, the indigenous cultures in this way. So the main cultures in these areas were the Olmecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs. And I'm guessing that you probably have heard of the Mayans and the Aztecs before, and that's where we're going to spend most of our focus, because these were the largest and most well-organized civilizations in ancient civilization in these areas. And they are also the most, we know the most about them because they had systems of writing and they left information behind. With regard to particularly the Mayan culture, there is still a continuity of that culture into the present time. And so you can travel into parts of Mexico now and actually engage with people who are still living immersed in the Mayan culture. So it's not a culture that's been completely wiped out, even though the civilization itself, as it was at the time that we're going to be talking about, has been completely supplanted by modern civilization, we would say. And so the areas that we're going to focus on geographically with the Mayans and the Aztecs, the Mayans were mostly their civilization was mostly in this area here, which is called the Yucatan Peninsula. And the Aztecs were mostly in this area here. They were later on, and that is just southern, considered to be southwestern Mexico. So to give you an idea of the breadth and number of cultures that there were in Central America and or Middle America, grouping it together with Mexico in ancient times, comparable to the number of tribes that we saw in North America in the last section, or the last two sections of this lecture. There were many different cultures and tribal units across Central America and Mexico historically. And these were, as I said, we're gonna focus almost entirely on the Mayans and the Aztecs today, simply because we don't have the time and scope in this lecture in order to cover more of them, but also because, as I said, they had systems of writing and particularly systems of astronomy and calendaring that were very interesting and have been passed down because those have been preserved. So going on to the Mayans were the earlier civilization as compared to the Aztecs, and they flourished from about 1000 BC to about 1000 AD in Mesoamerica, predominantly in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, or what's now Mexico. And they were the only Native American culture to have a fully developed written language. So this is the reason why we know more about them. They also left behind quite impressive structures when the civilization did cease to exist as an organized civilization. And there are preserved and in some instances slightly reconstructed or left as they are ruins all over this part of Mexico that you can go and visit. This particular image here is of the Pyramid of Kulkan. It is at Chichen Itza, in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and it was built sometime between the 9th and the 12th centuries AD. And so you can compare this to, for example, the structures and the timing of the Egyptian pyramids, which were slightly earlier but had a similar structure. And we know that there was no direct communication between these cultures, although whether people had migrated over that huge span of time is an open question at this point, which is currently being explored through DNA evidence. And I've actually climbed this particular pyramid myself. I was born and raised in Texas, and we used to vacation in Mexico quite frequently. And so I've actually climbed this one. To give you an idea of the size of this pyramid, you can see that there are people down here standing in the side ground. And so you can compare that to the number of steps that you have to take to go up the stairways up to the top of this pyramid. It's not anywhere near in size to the scope of the Egyptian pyramids, but it is part of a larger complex there in Chichen Itza, which has all sorts of other ruined structures that are there, including things like ball fields where they used to play various games, which I think the penalty for losing the game was actually death. So this was a warrior culture in its mainstay. So in Mayan religion, we have a lot of interface between religion and science. So science and religion were considered the same, one and the same altogether. And it is also true that philosophy, or their philosophy was that astronomy and mathematics, which we consider to be sciences, that these were priestly inventions. So the priests in this society were the intellectuals, and that's true in lots of other cultures that we will look at across this semester. And quite often, the priests are the philosophers, are the scientists, and are the respected and venerated members of the community. And so they're quite leaders in their community in these cultures. The theologians of this culture were also scribes, and we see this especially in early Christianity. We will see this when we get into Europe. They were mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers. So these were the great thinkers that were also the philosophers and priests of the culture. Religion was part of daily life in these cultures, and it was woven into every aspect of daily life. And so every moment in time was considered to have a divine purpose or divine worth, and to be significant on some level in a spiritual sense of the term. So this is also true. We see this across multiple nature-based cultures in the past. Life and death were considered to be cyclical in nature, and the way that one died was what determined one's destiny in the afterlife. And so this is common to other warrior cultures as well. For example, the Vikings believed that if you died in the act of being a warrior or waging war, then you went to a more venerated place called Valhalla, and if you didn't, then you were sort of damned to the underworld. It was the same thing in Mayan culture. They believed that the soul was vanquished to the underworld unless you died either being a warrior or giving birth. So they actually gave a position to that with regard to women and the function that women played in the society. And it was true that even the rulers of the society were meant to go to the underworld. And so the rulers of the society were not venerated unless they were also warriors. And so that was an interesting aspect there as well. And the underworld was said to be plagued by evil spirits. And so it might be similar to the Christian conception of hell or other aspects of Christianity. But certainly this was a philosophy from far before the advent of Christianity. Additionally, everything was considered by the Mayans to have a soul, and that included plants and animals and people and houses and other inanimate objects as well. So everything was imbued with a soul. And that you can see how that would connect to having religion or spirituality be part of daily life, and that everything has a spiritual significance as you move through your daily life. Excuse me. They were also a polytheistic culture, which means that they worshipped a whole pantheon, a number of gods, and this was common to the cultures of this time as well, pre-Christian or pre the Abrahamic religions. Definitely true of the nature-based cultures of history. So they had more than 165 gods, and their gods were more people-like than we consider gods to be. So they were born, they grew up, they gained wisdom, they died, and then they engaged in lots of different human-like activities. And so they had a very human element to them. And in their polytheistic religion, they also believed that we are born with an animal companion that is of the same spirit as us. And so we see some similarity there to the native North Americans and their treatment of what's called spirit animals, the animals that will help support us in our lives, or the spirits of the animals that will help support us through our lives and keep us companion and share their wisdom. Within this culture, they also practice human sacrifice, and this is also not uncommon in warrior-based cultures historically. I'll mention again the Vikings, of course, who also engaged in human sacrifice, and there's some evidence that the ancient Celts and the areas around Western Europe and the British Isles also engaged in these things before Christianity came along. So the image on this slide is actually the depiction of a date using symbols from the Mayan calendar. And the date that is represented here is 11 August of 3114 BCE, and that is considered to be the date of creation in Mayan myths. So 3114 BCE is when they believed that the world was created. Mayan medicine is a very complex system of medicine, perhaps more complex than some of the other tribal cultures that we've seen thus far. A lot of mixture of shamanistic, empirical, and scientific practices that are administered by specialist healers. And disease is considered in Mayan medicine to be a manifestation of imbalance, and we see this theme very commonly across a lot of nature-based spiritualities and cultures, that staying in balance, whether it's yourself in balance with nature or yourself in balance within yourself, is the way to stay healthy and be whole and have a whole experience of your journey as a human. And going out of balance is the way to disease and illness. And so healers sought to balance the flow of life force within a person. And so this theme of life force is something that we also see very commonly across ancient cultures and on up into the present in some of our complementary and alternative medicines as well, which we'll talk about later in the semester. But it was a very common theme in the nature-based philosophies. So there were 6 principles of Mayan healing, and we'll cover those principles in the next few slides. The image here, which is a bit grainy in this size, is an image of a native Mayan healer performing a healing ritual in Tikal, Mexico. And I don't know if you can tell this from the photo, but the guy here in the front ground is wearing like a polo shirt. So this is a more modern day Mayan healer. As I said, the Mayan culture is still somewhat in practice in some parts of Mexico, and you can encounter it quite readily. And so this is a modern Mayan healer. You'll notice he has a bandana on his head, and that is a modern, it's a modern version of what they might have worn in the past, but more of a part of our native, our modern culture these days. So moving on to the principles, the first principle of Mayan medicine is that relating to the life force. Now I'll tell you that I have some experience pronouncing some Mayan words, and some of them I don't. And so the ones that I have experience with I will pronounce, and other ones I will pass over. And I apologize for not being able to pronounce them all. So life force is pronounced Chu'ulel. And it's everywhere and it permeates everything. And this is something that we see as a contiguous theme, as I said, across many different cultures by many different names that we'll see this semester. And the life force is said to pervade mountains and rivers and plants and houses and people. So it is in a similar way to the fact that they considered everything to have a soul. Everything has this life force, and this is what enlivens things and gives them their spirit. So the Chu'ulel is spiritually divine, and it binds everyone and everything together. It's considered to be sort of the universal energy that holds all of creation. The second principle is that there's no separation between the body and the soul. So obviously this means that they were approaching medicine as a holistic undertaking. We're looking at the body along with all the other aspects of a person that might indicate lack of wellness, including the soul. The third principle, back to the second principle, they considered both the physical and the spiritual, and they were sort of at opposite ends of the continuum, but they were considered to be all on a similar continuum. And so medicine was said to aid the spirit in the healing process of sort of making sure that the continuum was connected between the physical and the spiritual. So on to the third principle. They recognized that natural cycles were extremely important. And when I say natural cycles, I'm talking about the cycles of the seasons or the cycles of birth and death of, say, a plant, for example, the cycles of the weather and how the weather might vary from day to day, cycles of the moon and the sun, and they were very accomplished astronomers, and so they were very aware of all of this. And they also really venerated plants. If you've ever been to southern Mexico, it is a very lush, rainforesty sort of place, very tropical, and you can see why they would venerate the plants, because the greenery and the sheer envelopment in the green there is quite overwhelming. The healers actually spoke to plants, and this is a reference to the shamanistic nature of their healing traditions. And the plants would choose certain healers and aid the healer in healing the sick. So the healer would do a journey, would go on a journey and communicate with a plant, or a plant would come to a healer and choose that healer during a journey, and in order that healer could use that plant to help heal a person, or even if there was something going on across the entire community, the plant might be medicine for the whole community. And that might be a physical illness, or it might be spiritual unrest of some sort. So just remembering that those were all the same thing. There's no separation there. The fourth principle is a belief that healing is a comprehensive and integrative approach with everyone. So again, this is a very holistic and very also community-minded view of medicine, that it's necessary for the entire community as well as the individuals to be healthy. And so the healer and the patient and the plants and the spirits and the community all work together, and no element is seen as more important than any other element, although I would say that the use of prayer in healing was probably considered somewhat above the other modalities, such as plants, for example. The fifth principle is that blood will determine the origin of illness, and the origin of illness would be considered to be either spiritual, emotional, or physical. But they look at the concept of blood as being a key factor in illness, and we see this in some other cultures as well. Chinese medicine is the first one that comes to mind in that regard. And then the state of the blood also would determine the course of treatment. Now, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that certainly when we talk about the state of the blood in these types of traditional healing modalities, we're not talking about, taking blood out and looking at it under a microscope or examining the biochemical or physiological constituents of blood. We're talking about they had observations of symptoms or symptom pictures that would tell them about the state of the blood. And that is similar in Chinese medicine as well. And the sixth principle is that of hot and cold. And so we're not going to talk about the four elements in the Mayan medicine realm, but if you'll remember back to the four elements of the Native North American medicine framework, and I said that we're going to talk about that a lot as the semester continues across numerous different cultures. Hot and cold, or that duality of, in Chinese medicine, it would be yin and yang. Sorry, I should swap those. If we're saying hot and cold, it's yang and yin, and we'll talk about that in Chinese medicine. And in every system where we talk about the four elements, there will be this contrast of hot elements and cold elements. The coldest element is water, the hottest element is fire. And so in the Mayan medicine principles, they had this duality, this concept of the dualing nature of hot and cold. And if you'll recall, I talked about the importance that they placed on keeping things in balance, keeping the person in balance. And so balancing the hot and cold within a person was one of the things that they used as part of their medicine. And so a symptom that would be considered hot, we can relate to this, fever. Diarrhea was considered hot, and we still consider diarrhea as being something that actually clears heat from the body. If you think about the action of diarrhea and how it flushes things, as well as vomiting, that is the way the body clears heat. And so those were considered hot symptoms. Hot foods, if you wanted to encourage more of the hot principle within a person, you would prescribe hot foods for them to eat: garlic, onions, peppers, and ginger. And if you've ever drank ginger tea and experienced the way that really increases the heat in your body, and especially perhaps in your extremities, if your hands and feet are cold, then you might relate to that, or how if you eat something with a lot of chili, it actually makes you sweat. So we know those are hot foods. And then there were cold symptoms, and those would be cramps. Cramps were considered cold because they were a contraction. If you think about the way that the world feels during the winter, it feels very contracted, and cramping is a contraction. Constipation, that's also a holding on that is not natural, and it's sort of, the diametric opposite, of course, of diarrhea. And something like paralysis, also a contraction or a lack of movement. So if you think about how movement generates heat, stillness is a cold thing. And example of cold food, cheese, I would say probably any kind of dairy would also fall into that category as well. And so those foods would be used to balance, and there's these are not an exhaustive list of foods or other things that might be used to encourage hot or cold, or to counteract hot or cold symptoms within a person. So in Mayan medicine, there was also this connection to the gods and goddesses, as we see in lots of the ancient cultures. Ixchel is a Mayan moon goddess and goddess of medicine and healing. And the image here on this slide is Ixchel. And in her main form, she is the mother goddess and the weaver who set the universe in motion. So she is the instigator of the motion in the universe, which is interesting because in other cultures, motion is considered a masculine trait rather than a feminine trait associated with a goddess. So it's just an interesting thing to note. And then Chakkel was the old moon goddess, and she was called the midwife of creation. So we have here again, this is a bit more of an archetypal feminine that we might think of a woman as giving birth to creation, or the feminine as giving birth to creation. So this was obviously an indication of their culture's veneration for the female principle and for the feminine, which is also very common in the nature-based cultures and philosophies. A curandero or curandera, so this is a Mexican word, not a Mayan language word, that means healer in Spanish. Curandero is a male healer, and curandera is a female healer. The type of healing done by these healers is called curanderismo, and is a form of Native American healing. And you see this a lot at this point in time in the southwestern United States, as well as throughout Mexico and Central America, and even into South America, which we're going to tackle in our final part of this session. So curanderismo includes prayer, herbal medicine, other types of healing rituals, and a lot of spirituality, as well as physical medicine like massage and psychic healing. So it's a pretty evenly divided sort of spiritual, energetic pursuit that has physical components like the massage and the herbal medicines as well. And it's a traditional system of beliefs that are really common even today amongst Hispanic American communities. And when I use the term Hispanic American, I'm talking about all parts of America, North, Central, and South. But Hispanic, those of Spanish descent, which have also clearly historically blended with Mayan and later Aztec and other indigenous cultures as well. So it's definitely a big amalgamation of things. Moving on to the Aztecs. So the Aztecs were slightly later than the Mayans. They came from the remote north of Mexico and the parts of North America, probably around the early 13th century. And then in 1325, they settled on the southwest border of Lake Texcoco, which is just here on this map, and that became the center of Aztec civilization. So this is after the fall of the Mayan civilization, which happened somewhere around 1000 AD. The Mayan civilization did fall prior to any form of exploration or colonization coming from Europe or other places. And in some ways, it's still not entirely understood why the Mayan civilization fell. But the Aztec civilization came in within a few hundred years after that, and they centered around this particular place. So the capital city of their civilization is here. It's called Tenochtitlan, and it is in south central Mexico, so not centered on the ocean. The image here is actually the land area that was covered by the civilization when it was at the height of its robustness. So it was a pretty widespread area of land if you consider the fact that there was no automated forms of transportation. So the Aztecs are pretty widely known, as are the Mayans, for their astrological calendar and for their systems of astrology. And their astrological calendar actually bore more likeness to some aspects of our modern calendar now. They had a solar year that was 365 days. That's just like ours is now. But it was divided into 18 months of 20 days. And then there were 5 unlucky days appended onto that. And it's the calendar here is very important to medicine because, as I said, they venerated the natural cycles, and they were very, very aware of the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the sun, the cycles of the life and death of plants, etc., and when things grew and when they died back. And all of that was very important in terms of being tracked by the calendar, as well as, there likely being these unlucky days whereby you probably wouldn't want to undertake any healing rituals on those days because they might not have a good outcome, as well as things like hunting and things like that. And so they also had a religious or a ritual calendar that was an entirely separate calendar, and it was made up of 260 days, so shorter than the solar year, the way we view it, and it had 13 months that were 20 days each. So I don't know if the 20-day monthly cycle was the same across both of these calendars, if it was contiguous days, but the months were shorter, and each month was ruled by a god. So there was a 13 different gods that were associated with this religious or ritual calendar. And the ritual calendar would determine things like when certain celebrations would take place and those sorts of things. The following of these two calendars, obviously, because this civilization had a system of writing and a system of calendaring, which we see on the image here, they were able to follow this according to the way that they had documented it. So the image here is the stone of the sun, which is also known as the Aztec calendar stone, and it was discovered in 1790 in what is now Mexico City. So that is actually slightly further north than the map that I just showed you of where the center of the Aztec civilization was. So that's sort of interesting. In the Aztec religion, they believed in an afterlife. So as opposed to going to the soul going somewhere after death, whether you're venerated as a warrior or from dying from giving birth, or whether you go to the underworld like the Mayans, the Aztecs actually believed in an afterlife. And this was a concept of heaven that was perhaps had some similarities to the way we think about heaven now. And it consisted of a heaven in the sun that was reserved for heroes, and a heaven on the earth, which was the abode of rest. And then there was an underworld that was reached by the dead after they went through a dangerous journey. And so this image here is a cosmogram of the way the Aztecs viewed the cosmos. And the sun god is featured here in the center. Their religion really circled around the sun god, and that's the reason why their concept of heaven was reserved for heroes, because that was the greatest veneration of the soul. The world was created by God within their religion under a dual principle, and the dual principle consisted of a male principle and a female. These are here some words that I won't attempt to pronounce because they're a bit long for me. But again, we see this making sure that there's a balance between the masculine and the feminine principles within a nature-based religion, although this one was a religion that was established significantly after the Abrahamic religions had come into being in other places on the planet. So there was a mother goddess, Toki, and she was the goddess of medicine and medicinal herbs. So we see a feminine principle associated with medicine. And then we have another one that I'm not going to try and pronounce, the god of war, who was masculine. There was Tlaloc, which was the god of agriculture, Quetzalcoatl, who was the god of wisdom, and another one that I'm not familiar with, who was the god of death. So the image here on the slide is that of Toki, who is the mother goddess, and she was the goddess of medicine and medicinal herbs. The medicinal art in Aztec culture was called Tiquiotl, and it was believed to have been developed by 4 wise men, which is, interesting. There's that balance there again between the masculine and the feminine, because there's a goddess of medicine, and then medicine, the medical art, was believed to have been developed by 4 wise men. So we have the balance there. It has profound religious elements in it, just like we saw with the Mayan system. And we have the idea that sickness could be a punishment by the gods. For example, Tlaloc, the god of waters, was responsible for rheumatic ailments. So rheumatic is your joints, aches in your joints, including gout, and then other kinds of dampness and cold syndromes. So we see here the concept of cold associated with illness. So there was a close relationship not only between the gods and the concept of cause of illness, but also between the gods and treatment of illness. And so gods were called upon in the healing art in order to help to heal a person from illness. And the image here on this slide, as you might be able to read the script at the top, which has been changed into an English version or a more anglicized version of it, is Tlaloc, the god of the waters. And the healers in Aztec society were expert herbalists, as they were in Mayan culture and other native cultures as well. And perhaps there might have been some knowledge of herbal medicine that was transmitted from the Mayan culture into the Aztec culture, because, as I said, the Mayan civilization did fall, but the culture did not disappear. So I'm sure that there was some communication of knowledge from that prior civilization into the Aztec culture and medicine. And physicians in their culture, in Aztec culture, were highly regarded, but we don't have the evidence that they necessarily had the same sort of broad breadth of philosophical knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, etc., that they had in the Mayan culture. So that brings us to the end of part 3. We've got your revision questions here, which are also listed on your LMS. And our other food for thought question, the downfall of the Aztec civilization was an epidemic, new illnesses brought by colonizing Spanish, and this would have been from the late 1400s onward. According to Aztec medical thought, what might they have believed to be the cause of these illnesses? So go back and revisit what we talked about as cause of illness during this session and think about what the Aztecs might have thought as the epidemic swept through their civilization and brought it down really to its knees. Thank you for joining for this session, and we'll continue on in part 4.